Right, well, good morning, everybody, and thank you. I can see people are beginning to join the session, so we'll give this a couple of minutes just to allow participants to join us today. My name is Corinne Podger, and I manage professional development at the Walkley Foundation here in Australia. And I'm super excited about today's session. So we have three wonderful speakers, and of course this session is we're joined by our sponsor. So let's get started. So as we know, climate change is one of the most important issues of our time, but finding fresh ways to tell climate stories and make them interesting to audiences of all ages across different platforms is not easy. As we're heading towards the next UN Climate Change Conference in November, you may be looking for ideas, and of course you might be thinking, how can I make the content that I'm sharing, the stories that I'm telling, less about gloom and doom and more about topics that perhaps people will find engaging and are willing to click through to. So today we're joined by Jo Lauder, a journalist with the ABC Climate team. Jo hosted the first ABC Climate podcast, which was called Who's Going to Save Us, which won a 2023 Covering Climate Now award. She also hosted the ABC's Environmental History podcast, Saving the Franklin, and was the Melbourne reporter for Triple J's current affairs show Hack. Liam Mannix is the national science reporter for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. He recently completed the Climate Explorers. It's a 5-month program at the Constructive Institute at Aarhus University, which brought together journalists from around the world to find new ways of covering climate that resonate with audiences. And then we're joined by Andrew McCormick, who today joins us in his capacity as Deputy Director of Covering Climate Now, a global journalism collaboration that aims to strengthen climate change reporting. This webinar is proudly supported by Tellum Media, and we're joined by Tellum co-founder Tim Weller, who'll begin with a welcome and welcome to country. Over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Corinne. I'm Tim Weller, ANZ Director from Tellum Media, which is Australia, New Zealand, and wider Asia Pacific's leading media intelligence platform. Hopefully those journos and comms people amongst you know us already. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're participating in today's webinar from the lands of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we all work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating. If you're not familiar with us, media is all about creating connections. We bring together journalists and comms professionals through our media database, editorial requests, live media panel events, and information services for both journalists to receive pictures in the way they prefer in the best way possible. We're proud to have been a long-standing partner of the Walkleys and continue to strive in helping journalists and PRs keep informed on industry developments, promote job opportunities, and source expert contacts from our network. Basically, we're here to help connect the industries. Now that's enough from me. I'll pass back to Corinne, and I look forward to the insight from our esteemed panel that we have the lovely relevance with today.
Thanks so much, Tim. So we'll start with Andrew, but before we get cracking, we're trying to make this a very informal sort of conversation, really. There's a chat box and a Q&A box. I would like you to ignore the Q&A box and just use the chat box. It means I only have to look at one box. You can drop questions in there to any of our panelists at any time. All 4 of us will be keeping an eye on it and we'll be jumping on those. And there will also, of course, be some time at the end for discussion. But if you've got a burning question as we go along, please drop it in the chat box. So I'd like to turn first to Andrew. So Andrew, you helped set up Covering Climate Now in 2019. Tell us a little bit about that journey and the needs that it set out to address.
Sure. And well, first of all, I just want to say thanks for having me here. I'm very grateful to be here with you all. Covering Climate Now, as you say, started in 2019. Covering Climate Now, for those who don't know, is a joint project of Columbia Journalism Review, The Nation magazine, which is a progressive outlet in the US, and The Guardian. In the spring of 2019, we put on a conference at Columbia Journalism School in New York. And the idea of this conference was just to gather journalists together and say, hey, we know that we are not, as a profession, getting the climate story right. We are not giving it the attention and prominence that it deserves, given the clear global threat that it poses. We brought hundreds of people showed up at this conference, and I think that we were really struck by the kind of passion and enthusiasm that people coming from around the US and a few people from even around the world brought to the conversation. Like people spoke very passionately. There were people in strong agreement with each other about the way to do things right. There were strong disagreements. And I think our takeaway from that was really that the media isn't ignoring climate because journalists don't know that it's important. We're missing the climate story maybe because all of those journalists out there don't feel that there's kind of a collective buy-in across the profession that we need to be getting this right. Yet here we all are in this room agreeing with each other. So we sensed an opportunity for kind of a rallying cry. And I think that we set up Covering Climate Now in the wake of this conference to do that, to be kind of a strong voice, rooted in, I think, fairly well-known journalistic institutions, advocating for stronger, more frequent, more prominent climate coverage. We organized on the occasion of the UN General Assembly focused on climate in September of 2019. That's when we kind of, I think, really launched to the public. We put out a call for various journalism organizations to like, hey, please join us. Like, we're putting on this thing called Covering Climate Now. Would you like to be part of it? I think we expected maybe a small handful of outlets to join us. We expected maybe a trickling of a dozen or two outlets to get on board, and we expected those relationships to be hard won. Instead, we got a deluge of hundreds of outlets that wanted to be part of it. And I think that, that we're all still back in 2019 here, and there's been 5 years of Covering Climate Now since then. But that was really a moment of like, okay, we are tapping into something here. There is an opportunity to help the industry grow, and Covering Climate Now has, for those few years since then, just intended to be a cheerleader in that regard.
And so what does improved covering climate look like? What is it what's the vision of that? What did you feel, I'm thinking back to my own journalistic career and, covered one of the UN Sustainable Development Conferences, about 20 years ago. So the coverage of the issue has been around for a long time. What does doing it better look like?
Right. I think that what better looks like has evolved a little bit as the industry has evolved over the past several years. I mean, I think that where we're at now in terms of climate coverage, really on a global level, is in night and day to where we were 5 years ago. When Covering Climate Now first started, the goal was really just to help our journalism outlets break the climate silence. That's what we said. Like, we need to get talking about this. I think since then we've seen, outlets around the world, again, set up climate desks, develop policies with regard to, how we talk about climate change. Do we, for instance, call it a climate crisis? We've talked over the years about the importance of having roots in solutions when it comes to our climate coverage, meaning that, we don't just present a problem to audiences. We always keep in mind that this is a solvable problem and try to present the story through that lens. Kind of fast forwarding to today, though, I will note that on Covering Climate Now's website, for those who want to go look for it, we've got a wide array of resources, and one of those is Covering Climate Now's best practices, and that is a list of several key things that we think outlets can do to get their climate coverage right. But I'll mention 3 specific things, and that's kind of based on where I think the climate journalism industry is right now. One is that we need to get climate out of its silo. We need to help journalists across the newsroom understand that climate is not just a story for the climate journalists and the environmental and science journalists over there. It's a story that stretches across and in many ways unifies all the other beats in the newsroom. And it's something that, although certainly we will continue to have climate and environmental journalists who, for whom that is their beat. Climate, we need to believe that every journalist, in every newsroom can think of themselves as in part a climate journalist. They can understand this story better and integrate it better into their coverage. I also think that we need to do a better job of not just attacking the climate story head on, but slipping it in to stories about other things that are major topics on people's minds. We know, those of us following the climate story, that there are huge connections to issues like the economy, to housing, to healthcare, making sure that like even when climate isn't a top issue on people's minds or doesn't seem to be breaking through in the discourse. I mean, for instance, in the US right now, climate has not been a prominent topic in the election conversation, but the economy, housing, and healthcare have. All of those have major climate connections that as journalists we can be drawing and showing people that like you may not think that you're a climate person, but you are an economist or you do care about your housing. And for that reason, you should also care about climate change.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I would say that I think it's really important to never forget that the climate story has a strong, strong backing in science. Those of us on the call know this and are confident in this, but I think that I think that we have spent years kind of getting used to the climate story and have maybe forgotten that our audiences aren't all where we are. I think remembering that, you know, when you have, I apologize for the US centric example here, but when you have Kamala Harris advocating essentially for climate solutions and Donald Trump saying that windmills cause cancer, we can't just present those as two opinions. We need to say that, you know, there is a global scientific consensus on the realities of climate change and the need for solutions. Here are, you know, these two comments in light of that context. I think we just kind of can't, because we're used to all the facts and we've been debunking, you know, these false claims for years and years. We can't forget that audiences are still coming to the table for whom, you know, some of these kind of false ideas or some of this uncertainty around climate change might not have been fully dispelled.
Mm-hmm. There's one more question I wanted to ask you, Andrew, perhaps because you're approaching this conversation with the hat of an organisation on as opposed to specifically a media outlet, I guess, and that is, do you feel that the industry has moved past denialism? And where do you feel audiences, when you're thinking about the kind of coverage that's presented as best case to covering climate now, and we'll talk about the awards in a minute, what do you feel is going on with denialism, both with the industry and with audiences?
I think we'd be pretty hard pressed to find denialists as a kind of pervasive force in newsrooms anymore. I mean, there might be, you know, one or a few hanging out in the opinion sections of avowedly conservative outlets. But I think that we've kind of beaten that out of the system a little bit.
That does seem to be one of the major changes since covering climate now started, perhaps in 2019. I think if one was to think back to then, it would seem to still be more of an issue.
Right, definitely. I do think that there is still maybe for some newsrooms. I mean, I don't want to paint with a broad brush. Different newsrooms have different audiences and they know their challenges, particularly newsrooms, you know, covering conservative audiences or covering conservative areas or serving a conservative audience. Not everything I can say here will apply to every newsroom, but I do think there's a residual fear that climate is not of interest to audiences. And so on the part of newsroom leaders, editors, producers, I think there's a bit of an outdated sense of the amount of curiosity that people have for the climate story. And that can still, for climate reporters, present challenges in terms of, you know, really needing to argue that, no, we do need to cover this story, or no, this story does not belong on the back page or at the end of the broadcast. I think that those are still fights a lot of journalists are having in newsrooms, and that's because we haven't maybe built up the climate competence and or confidence amongst those newsroom leaders to understand, like, yes, this is a story that we can effectively tackle. It doesn't only need to be the climate journalist, the one reporter kind of carrying the torch. Like,
and that brings us really, sorry to interrupt, but that really brings us to where we are, I suppose, today. Where we're joined with, you know, by a couple of journalists who are doing that kind of coverage, but also perhaps thinking about it in ways that are not, you know, dull and worthy. which is where I suppose we're kind of hoping the coverage will perhaps continue to evolve into the future. Andrew, I wanted to ask you one last question, which is to tell us about the awards, just to give a bit of context, and then we'll go to Joe, who's won one of those awards. But give us a bit of background first.
Yeah, so 4 years ago, we started an awards program. This was our 4th year. We issued the awards in the summer. Our goal was really simple. It was just to highlight and help amplify and kind of celebrate great climate journalism happening around the world. One of the things that I think that Covering Climate Now has done really well has been to create a community of climate journalists, whereas a lot in the past, I think there was this kind of sense of loneliness amongst climate journalists. They kind of knew they were working hard in their newsroom, but they didn't know the climate journalists at other publications were kind of dealing with the same stressors that they had. I think that we created the awards just as a way of saying, like, hey, there is a lot of great work going on out there. And, you might be at a newsroom in Missouri in the middle of the United States and be able to take inspiration from the way a independent outlet in India or a big newspaper in France took up a story. We wanted to just highlight, elevate those examples. I think our awards program is fairly unique in that it is truly global, and we accept, all forms of climate journalism. And I think that it's just kind of been a joy and a privilege to participate as we have grown that awards program. And obviously, Joe Lauder here worked on a piece called "Who Can Save Us?" Joe, sorry if I got that wrong. Who's going to save us? And that was one of those pieces that, like, we've just been very happy to be able to share with other journalists, send along, like, hey, here's an example of how somebody else took up this idea. You might find something in it for you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. So, Joe, you've been trailblazing climate change coverage at the ABC for quite some time now. I was a very happy listener to the Who's Going to Save Us podcast because it came out not long after I did accreditation training as a solutions journalism trainer. And so it's been a case study in my deck for a while. So very grateful.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about that show and what you wanted to do differently.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. So Who's Going to Save Us? I can tell you just a little bit about the podcast. So it was a narrative podcast, 8 episodes, and it was all about climate action and the people fighting for it was how we described it. And it was a collaboration with Triple J, where I was working at the time, with Hack, which is a youth news and current affairs show, and ABC Science. So, we had a lot of experience on both sides, but I think also with the Triple J audience, it was something that came up because the younger audiences really cared about this issue. And we've been hearing that for quite a while from them, for years. And even in this period, I think, the climate wars in Australia, I feel like there was a lot of fatigue in newsrooms about this idea that people didn't want to talk about climate change. It was politically divisive and people were just kind of tired of this. And that wasn't the case at all with younger audiences. And so I think we really wanted to tap into that. But I think one thing that we really wanted to do, and I think we did succeed quite well in doing, was really focusing the episodes on everyday people and everyday communities and taking it away from a political or a technological framing, which I think we often, I love those lenses sometimes for climate reporting, but I think for the podcast, we really wanted to make it about everyday people. And so some of the examples were, there was an episode about people who had quit their job because of climate change and because of their beliefs around climate change and that they thought they were at odds with where they were working. There was one about scientists who were researching in this space in climate change or conservation and felt like just reporting on this issue and like producing the research and putting out their research wasn't enough. And they started getting involved in protest and what that meant for their work and, their perceived credibility at work. And there was a case as well of the First Nations community, the Gomeroi people, who brought a case against Santos using native title law. So that was kind of looking at the different legal mechanisms that people were using as well. Also citizens' assemblies in the Climate Citizens Assembly in France, just looking at what would happen if you gave everyday people education and capacity to learn about policies, but then also what they would come up with as a climate solution and what they would think is the best climate policy. So it was really broad, and it covered kind of lots and lots of different communities, from remote First Nations communities, small country towns, industrial towns that were transitioning. But I think really at the core, what we did was put everyday people at its center. And I think that really showed that I think this is an issue that people are grappling with a lot in their personal lives. But in a way that still gave them agency, I think, and like kind of, it was about solutions, but it wasn't just this kind of magic solution. Look, everything's okay. Here are people doing things so you don't have to. It's kind of looking at how it's applicable to everyday life and how people are changing the ways that they go about the world.
Mm-hmm. And was that something that you had in mind when you were coming up with story ideas?
It's really interesting.
Like, describe your process, because I guess part of the purpose of today is not it's not just the what, it's also the how.
Yeah, this is really interesting. It was interesting hearing Andrew talking about 2019, because the genesis of the podcast, it actually, I at a podcasting event went up to the EP Joel Werner, who was working in science at the time, and I was like, I want to make a podcast about climate change. I feel like it's not getting covered enough. And at the time, we were really like, I think people still don't realize they see it as this far off problem, or like a future problem, or kind of something, beyond the next political cycle even. And so we wanted to make a podcast that was really about climate impacts, and just being about like, it's here now. These are the front lines. These are like the areas or the species or the ecosystems that are under threat. And so that was towards the end of 2019 that we got that pitch up. And then we went on a break. And as everyone would know, we had Black Summer. And so then we had like catastrophic bushfires across so much of Australia. And then we came back and we were thinking about how we would change it slightly. And then we had the pandemic. And so a big focus of the podcast was getting reporters. It's not just me, there's reporters from all over the country, and getting them out into communities. And so we waited until we could travel again. And we had floods as well, the East Coast floods and around Lismore. And so by the time we actually came back and we could send reporters around the country, we realized that the climate conversation had actually shifted quite a bit in that time. Around, we'd had some really devastating impacts in Australia, but also I think the appetite as well, people's like relationship with the news at the time and media had changed a bit. And so we wanted to find a different way into climate stories that weren't like just hopeful stories, but also just weren't about the like hitting people over the head with the problem. And so that was really intentional. So we tried to find like really putting people or communities at the center, and commissioning, just being like, what's something that you find a really interesting story or a really interesting space where there's a transition or there's a debate happening in the community. But we really put that I think in our mind. The other thing that when I think about like climate reporting that I like, and kind of what I think really resonates, there's like outrage and optimism as like kind of like these two tensions. Or I have a friend who is I used to work with a Triple J, and she, sorry for the language, but she used to call stories that resonated, that's fucked or fuck yeah. And I think those were kind of like two of the themes that really cut through, that we were able, also because it was for a younger audience, but they were kind of like the emotional themes that I think did really well here as well with the story. So yeah, long way to answer it. But yeah, we really did think intentionally about the kinds of stories we wanted to tell.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to bring in Liam, and then we'll sort of move to a more broad-ranging conversation. And I think this question in the chat from Jack, why isn't this front page news every day, and what can be done to make reporting on this topic push this up the news agenda? I suppose in a way that's kind of the purpose of today's conversation. I did want to, before we come to Liam, sorry, Liam, I just wanted to pick up on the more recent piece that you've been working on, Joe, which is the Saving the Franklin podcast. Again, how has that tried to do climate change reporting differently?
Yeah, so this was a narrative history podcast about, for people that don't know, like the biggest environmental campaign in Australia's history, which was around a hydropower scheme in Tasmania in an area that's now like remote wilderness heritage area, World Heritage Area. And so it was in the early 80s, but the campaign ran for about a decade. And it's also really the birthplace, I think, of the modern conservation and environmental movement in Australia and environmental politics. And so it was really about going back and looking at the lessons or kind of the story of this, this campaign and the politics around it and what's relevant for today. Because I think often, you know, we think that we're going in history, that we're going through these things for the first time and these themes are unique to our time, but there's actually a lot of similarities and a lot of lessons. And so it was about climate change. It was kind of one of those, I guess, a sideways approach to climate change. But some of the things that I found really interesting was looking at that campaign was around the divisiveness of it. One thing that really came through was it was incredibly divisive, especially in those communities in Tasmania and the remote southwest, because it was seen as locals who wanted the work on these hydro dams. And, you know, they felt like it was going to be in their interest, their economic interest, and for their families and future generations. And they felt like there was a conservation movement that came in from elsewhere and told them, that came in and told them what was best for them. And it created a real divisiveness. And I think it also brought up for the first time in Australia this rhetoric around like greenies versus workers. And so I think it was really about like looking at some of those lessons around like divisions in the community, but also there's a lot of nuance in it as well. There was this, and apologies, I don't remember the researcher, journalism researcher, but they talked about complicating the narrative. And I think that this is a really good example of like, it wasn't really cut and dry of like one community versus the other, or like good versus bad, or like greenies versus the environment as it was portrayed at the time. It was really trying to find those, I guess, the ways that there were similarities, or like what was motivating people. And I think there's also a lot of lessons there for climate journalism as well, of like, sometimes it's not really black and white, it is complicated, and you have to and travel to those places and speak to people and try and really understand, I think, is also a really big part of that journalism.
Yeah. The campaign to save the Franklin was when I was in my early teens. And I remember thinking about the way that those, you know, the confrontational nature of that campaign filtered through to me as, you know, as not a journalist, just a young person absorbing. And it's when you mentioned the sort of greenies versus workers, I suppose I now retrospectively would look at that as a media construct. Right. So those attitudes come from somewhere. Where did they come from?
Yeah. And I think it's been really politicized and weaponized since then. And I think that, like, to the detriment, you know, of a lot of those communities and like a lot of our like debates in Australia since then. And I think there are a lot of lessons. And I also think, like I was saying about the nuance, you know, one thing we discussed in it as well is that this was, you know, if you look at it today, it was a renewable scheme. This was about hydropower. And so there were questions around that and the conservation movement. And obviously the climate conversation wasn't really a factor then. But it's really interesting looking back then around and like conservation and like going forward, the issues with conservation and renewables development. And the other big one was protest as well, because, you know, thousands of people were arrested. And, you know, when we look today in protest laws, that was another really a theme that's kind of relevant to today.
Yeah. This is a really good moment for me to, first of all, drop into the chat the link to the Saving the Franklin podcast, but also to turn to Liam. So Liam Mannix, national science reporter at the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Really, I suppose one of the things that we're talking about, let's get on to the climate explorers in a moment, but one of the things that we're talking about here is perhaps thinking about one's own beliefs or prejudices or, you know, the context of a conversation, and then turning to the science. How important is it for, in your view, for an understanding of the science when we start to do a climate story, whether it's from a solutions approach or a different approach, a hard news approach? How important is that?
I think there are two answers to that. The first is obviously an understanding of the basic science is really fundamental to all the reporting we want to do here. We had the pleasure in Denmark of spending a lot of time with carbon scientists, organic chemists. And once you kind of understand the CO2 problem on a molecular basis, you understand the difficulty of breaking these bonds between these atoms, the power of hydrocarbons, you can sort of see how all of the problems that we have build from this kind of miraculous chemistry at its heart. But I think there's another answer there too, which is thinking about the science of communication. I was really struck in Denmark by the focus that the Danes apply on thinking about what we know about the evidence of how people understand the news, what the news does to them, how that changes their thinking. It's not something I had ever really encountered in my career. I think that in journalism, there's a lot of assumed knowledge. These are the news values. These are what readers care about. Here's how we should cover them. Even that comes out of J school, to be honest. But once you start interrogating that science, you go, oh, okay, maybe there are, maybe what we're doing to readers is not always what we want to achieve, and maybe there are more effective ways of doing that.
Thank you. And I just want to circle back to the list of resources that Andrew posted in the chat, because I think it's a big area of science. There's a lot. Even just to read one of the IPCC reports is a big challenge, and it's, you need a glossary and it's quite a lot. So I think these, the plethora of resources that have been published in recent months to support journalists to do climate journalism better without needing a degree in microbiology or physics or anything else is really helpful. Let's talk about the Constructive Institute. So earlier this year, you were one of 5 climate explorers at the Constructive Institute in Denmark. Before we get on to that program, can you give us a short, perhaps, explanation of what constructive journalism is, and, if possible, how that differs in any particular way from solutions journalism? In my mind, they're not dissimilar. Andrew, you might also want to chip in a moment. But Liam, what is it? What's constructive?
I think they're definitely cousins. They both have a strong focus on solutions as an integral part of the way that we cover the news. But I think constructive journalism differs in that its critique of the news is much broader. And a lot of what they are focused on is this growing problem of news fatigue. We've known for a very long time that a large percentage of our audience, 60% in Australia, say that they actively avoid reading the news. They don't want to be exposed to it. They don't want to have anything to do with it. And, I think that really sucks, right? We do a lot of really good, important stuff. So the Constructive Institute says, well, perhaps we should look at this problem and go, why do readers not want to read us? Why do they avoid us? What can we do to bring them back? And a lot of the problems that they identify in terms of news valence, how it makes you feel, in terms of news repetitiveness, how it makes you feel about an issue, climate change really is at the heart of that. So their 2 broad points are that that culturally, as journalists, we have come to believe that negative stories are at the heart of a lot of what we do. And you see this in much news coverage. We think if it bleeds, it leads. We think that people want to know about these terrible things and that's what will draw readers to stories. But when you look at the psychological data, when you ask people, why don't you read the news? Their answer is because it's negative, because of how it makes me feel about my world. So you've got that problem for climate change, which we know is obviously a very negative story. We're looking at the greatest predictable threat to our way of life here. So it's going to be a negative story. Yep. And we know that we're not taking action fast enough. But you have this related problem in that we see from the psychological experiments, if you repeatedly expose a reader to a similar story over time, particularly a similar negative story, they very quickly come to view that story with anger, hostility, and a level of boredom. And they come to think, even if this is not what the story is saying, that no progress is being made. It's a simple psychological effect of repeat exposure to news. And this is a real problem for climate change because we're telling a story that can often be quite negative, and we're telling a story where there is often not a lot of progress being made. And so I think these sort of things combine to produce an audience where there is a significant degree of fatigue.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the Climate Explorers program. What did that involve? What were the overall goals, and what did you come away with that perhaps changed what you think about the way you're covering this issue?
Yeah, so the Constructive Institute in Denmark brought together 5 of us, myself, and some fantastic climate journalists from India and Argentina and Norway and Kenya, to spend 5 months interviewing climate journalists and climate scientists and communication scientists all around the world, with the idea being finding out what's working, finding out what's not working, and then building a report that offers some solutions for how climate journalism might go forward in the future with a more constructive lens, which obviously is what this institute is all about. And it was fantastic, actually. I came as an outsider, so I'm a science journalist, not a climate journalist. The Age has some incredible climate journalists, but I think they really wanted me there as sort of somebody who could be a bit of an external critic. So I came away thinking there is an incredible amount of incredible climate journalism that is being done, but are there ways that we can change coverage so that we can really draw readers through, so that we can make these stories be really valuable to the news organizations that we work for, so the news organizations can go, well, we can do this in a successful way. We can bring readers to these. I think that's kind of where I came into.
Yeah, and you've been back for a couple of months. What are you doing differently?
Yeah, what am I doing differently? I think there are a few things. First of all, I'm a science journalist, so I've always been interested in the evidence. But what comes through really strongly is that what readers want is human stories. We know from the evidence that it's not facts that change people's mind, it's stories, it's seeing people like them change. So I'm trying to make my stories much more human. I'm trying to really put a face on them, give people agency, show change. And then I'm trying to build in solutions. I think the honest thing is, if I look at my stories before, I was very focused on finding problems. And that's a thing in journalism culture. We're fantastic at finding problems. We reward it with awards, but we don't often link that problem to a solution. And so I'm trying to put that in a lot more. But as I was talking to the guys about just before this panel started, it can often be quite hard to draw that thread between what individuals can do and the systemic changes that we actually need to solve this big problem. So some successes, still some challenges.
Just to dig into that for a moment, though, the stories that you've done differently, are those resonating differently with audiences?
I think so.
What do the metrics say?
Oh, well, the metrics are certainly very positive. Yeah, I think we're having a lot of success telling stories that, look, I can only speak personally. I'm having a lot of success telling stories that are really human and that perhaps produce a slightly different emotional valence rather than just, here's something bad, here's a problem. I think that I have come to think that there is a role in news journalism for hope, which is a really odd thing and something I never would have said before I did this program. But if you think about it, if we agree that climate change is an existential threat, which we all do, and we agree that people need to change their behavior, that we need to change our systems to meet that existential threat, then you say, well, how do we achieve that? And I think hope is at the core of that, because if we don't have hope for a better future, if we don't have hope that we can solve the challenges that we face, why would we behave differently?
Thank you. Again, the green room, before we kicked off, we were talking a little bit about the misnomer perhaps of seeing solutions approaches or constructive approaches as just all about hope or the fluffy story at the end. But in fact, trying to think about these things as responses to problems and whether they work or not. Andrew, I saw you nodding, but and then might come to Joe afterwards about how the climate team has seen it within the ABC. But Andrew, is it a bit more than just offering people hope?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate so much of what Liam said. I think that I mean, all of our climate stories need to be aware of the fact that there are solutions, that this is a solvable problem. World scientists agree this is a solvable problem. Certainly, we are getting towards some red lines that if we cross those, it will make the problem that much more difficult to solve. But there are things we can do as the climate communications expert and climate scientist Catherine Hayhoe says, we know the solutions, they're out there, we just need to reach for them. I think that all climate storytelling needs to, I mean, even if we're telling a story about, a hurricane that just struck the coast and left a community in ruins, we need to mention that there is a bigger picture here. It is not just this devastation. There is, this is the result of fossil fuel burning on a global scale, and reeling this in can help mitigate some of these disasters. I think that solutions, when we talk about solutions journalism, we need to be clear-eyed about the threat while also being upfront with journalists, or excuse me, with audiences about the fact that there is something that can be done. Something that I want to mention specifically, Liam, you talked about threading that needle between what individuals can do in their own lives and the solutions that will be effective at scale, like the types of solutions that governments and large businesses need to implement so that we're actually bringing down global emissions. I think that audiences are really hungry to, I mean, there is a lot of curiosity about climate change, but I still think that for large sections of our audiences, it's this kind of fairly abstract and a little bit stratospheric problem where, even if people who have been through climate disasters in their own life, they're still not sure how to make heads or tails of the big picture, ideas that thread through the climate story about like how that relates to them. I think that showing people community-based solutions, showing people how their, neighbors and people living in communities like them are approaching resilience and adaptation and, even emissions reduction, can show people that like people like me care about this issue. And when we're covering those activities at the community level, there's an opportunity as journalists to say this is consistent with what scientists say is needed on a global scale. And here are how, nations or, large businesses are also trying to address this threat, but here's how it looks like. And, here's what that same thing looks like in this small community. I think that makes the concepts of this challenge much easier to understand, easier to navigate for audiences. And that's something that, as far as threading this needle goes, something that I'd like to see us all doing a lot more often.
Can I ask Andrew and Joe a question on this? Sorry, because I don't know the answer myself. It is clear that large major emitters like BP and Shell would really like us to see this as a problem of individual action. I mean, the carbon footprint is a creation of corporates. I worry that I see the value in this approach, but I worry that talking about individual action also plays into their hands. Like, I don't have an answer. What do you guys think about that difficulty?
Do you want me to go, Andrew?
Yeah, go for it.
This is almost more of like as an individual when I get asked this question, as opposed to me as a journalist approaching a story. But I think like the way I think about it is that I think like political systems and corporations don't move unless they see social capital or like in being able to do that. Like I think, political institutions won't enact a policy that they think is radically unpopular a lot of the time. And so that's where I think the power of like community-based action or activity or just talking about it or voting with your wallet, those things, that's where I see that this is all kind of part of the one system. And I also think like it's hard because it's a bit of both. You can't have just like system change without personal change, but like it can't be left to individuals. But I think also like it's kind of like the sum of everybody, if that makes sense. But yeah, I really think about like we underestimate, I think, the influence of not saying like one individual, but of like that social change being really powerful.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, I don't think we should be overly charmed by these individual stories. And we don't, as you say, we don't want to suggest that one community's actions or, more recycling in our individual lives can solve this, but we want to contextualize all these solutions. So if you are covering, the implementation of regenerative agriculture or even the reinforcement of seawalls in a certain coastal community or something like that, you want to say, zooming out, this is a part of, this runs parallel to or in opposition to what this state is doing to, mitigate climate change or reduce emissions. And then on a nationwide scale, this is how that fits in. Unfortunately, these things show examples of a way forward. They paint a picture of what's possible, but we need to contextualize them as part of a whole.
Thank you. I'm just conscious of time and some interesting questions that I wanted to draw out from each of you. Let's touch on, first of all, if people want to get started on rethinking their climate coverage. And I suppose there's one word that I want to home in on before I ask this question, which is the word solutions. I think when, certainly within the Solutions Journalism Network, when one does solutions journalism training, it's a word that actually gets pulled out to say, can we not use that word all the time? Could we replace it with response, for example? And to move away from this idea that there are solutions to things, but there are responses to things that you can then work out, are they effective or not effective? So perhaps if we just go into the remaining sort of 14 minutes with that in our minds. Joe and Liam, Joe, what would you recommend, first of all, to folks who want to get started, having now got these two large podcast projects behind you, and to perhaps achieve something that was asked in the chat box earlier? Why isn't this front page news every single day, and what can be done to make reporting on this topic push it up the news agenda? What's your tips? What would you suggest?
It's really tricky.
Maybe top three things.
I think have conversations in your organization about it. I feel like if you feel like your stories or your pictures aren't getting up, maybe like asking for follow-ups or like trying to unpick a little bit more of like why, if they think there's certain blocks. Or I think Liam touched on, I think broadly there's a bit of an issue. Like I think news organizations at the moment are really concerned about news avoidance, and climate is kind of lumped in as like it's a negative story and people don't want to read it. So I think maybe trying to keep that in front of mind of like how you, in terms of your framing or your pitching, or having conversations within the organization about what they think good climate journalism is, or maybe even coming up with some of your own examples. I think I learned a lot, and like the way I got started was I just pitched it heaps and I covered it heaps, and every time it was successful, I kind of like made people very aware of the fact that story. I was like, wow, that did really well. We got like so many comments. Like that's probably the most popular reaction we've had that day, or whatever it was. I think it kind of was socializing that idea. Also, I think just to plug Andrew's organization, Covering Climate now has so many good resources. Like I think it's really invaluable for journalists if you want to start. And really good for thinking about like good framing for climate stories and journalism, and what you should be keeping at the front of your mind. But to what you're saying around the solution stuff as well, I know like, or responses, were you saying? I think good journalism incorporates that as well. And it is about maybe not thinking of like, here's the problem, here's the solution. But I think I always think of this story I read once is about EV battery waste, and not to say that's not a problem, but it just had all the problem. And there was nowhere in the story about any regulations or like recycling or like what could be done about it. And I felt like, I think of it as an example because I actually just think it wasn't a good story because it actually lacked some of that context and came away with it just being a problem. And so I think being mindful of that as well, and just when you're thinking about it, kind of thinking it in the bigger picture of like what can be done. Because like Liam said, like there are solutions to just about all of these problems, or like speaking to people who are coming up with them if they're not there.
Thank you. Liam, did you want to respond to that? I think you're on mute, Liam.
Oh, I think that was Andrew who had that great comment, actually. Look, I think the other thing to mention, I agree with what Joe said, is to take comfort in the data. Like we know that a very large amount of the audience says they want to read climate change stories. There is a huge hunger there. When we survey, like we talked about denialism, when we survey them on denialism is such a tiny problem globally that we probably don't need to waste much energy on it, if any at all, I think. So there is an audience. If you can find the stories that if you can tell the stories in the right way, I think there are readers. My personal view is that we as journalists should never be afraid of going out and getting an audience. And I think we should be interested in that, because that's when we are at our most effective, when we have mass reach, when we can bring people through and talk to them about the problems that they face.
I'll jump in real quick if it's
Yes,
all right.
absolutely. And Andrew, as you're jumping in, I also have a follow-up question for you about smaller newsrooms. So if you can start to percolate that.
Oh, I was going to mention smaller newsrooms in
Fantastic. Excellent.
So on this question of, why isn't it front page news? I do want to mention the success that a few newsrooms have had in making climate more likely to be front page news. You've seen a lot of newsrooms, these tend to be larger newsrooms in recent years, creating climate desks. And I've recently heard editors at both The Guardian and at the New York Times talk about the functional effect that this has had within their newsrooms. It has meant that at those top editor meetings where you're going in and you're having, the politics desk and the metro desk and the national desk, go through and say what their top stories of the day are, go around a table and say what their top stories of the day are, and come to agreements together on what's going to be on the front page of, for instance, the New York Times. There is a climate person sitting in that room that is elevated to the level of those national, editors and the metro editors, who is having the opportunity to advocate for the inclusion, first of all, of a climate story on the front page, or having the opportunity to say, you know what, our top story of the day is that this hurricane is crashing into Florida, and I've read it and I noticed that there's no mention of climate change in the copy. Like, can we get that in there? Because crucially, not every climate story, quote unquote, needs to be only a climate story. It can be a story, a story about something that is a top headline, but that makes a climate connection, right? I'm talking about The Guardian and the New York Times here. These are obviously very large newsrooms that are well resourced and not something that everybody can replicate. I think that one thing that I'll note that I've seen smaller newsrooms doing a lot more of, which has had great effects for creating the types of stories that become, front page news, quote unquote, or the types of stories that lead broadcasts, is collaborating with other newsrooms, collaborating with other journalists. Again, with apologies for the US-centric example, in the US state of Utah, we have the Great Salt Lake, which is, an enormous saltwater lake, whose ecosystem and water levels have been really brought to the brink as a result of climate change. And, we know the state of, unfortunately, local news outlets, I think worldwide, but what we saw in the Salt Lake region was a variety of smaller newspapers, small local TV outlets, radio stations, getting together and mustering their collective resources to tell the big picture of how climate change is reshaping this lake that the community depends on. And they were able to create stories that none of those outlets necessarily, without dedicated climate reporters necessarily, would have been able to do all on their own. But because they did it together, they were able to create, a wide suite of coverage that was able to be, big, groundbreaking, attention grabbing, in a way that could be headline news for all of them. I will say too, in the awards, we've noticed a significant increase in spectacular work that's being done across state lines, across international boundaries, by journalists working in different mediums. Like, more and more of the work that's coming across our radar is being done in unexpected collaborations. I mean, even across continents. So that's something that I would really encourage journalists at smaller newsrooms to consider.
Fantastic. Now, one of the things that I've noticed over the last decade or so is that the United States and Europe in particular do collaboration really well. And that's in part because there's a bigger philanthropic / donor base in both those areas that will fund collaboration, but also the I suppose it's just a different sort of context. In Australia, it's less common. And it often needs, I think my overall observation is that it needs a third party to drive it. We also have quite a lot of media outlets in Australia, which is just one person in a place, and that's it. Like, that's the media in that place. So for those kinds of outlets, and I think speaking to the question that was posed here, what's your advice for newsrooms with limited human and financial resources? Many not-for-profit, independent, community-based organisations don't have the resources. So in the sort of 5 minutes or so, let's think about how somebody like that would get started. And I also just want to throw into that context, those are also the journalists that are most likely to perhaps be confronted with climate denialism. So let's just take a moment to percolate. How would we assist that reporter to get started and do better climate coverage, which may include solutions or constructive approaches? Jo, are you ready to? No? Or
I
shall
was
I
thinking
come?
about it. I feel like
Yeah.
in some ways, you know, you're already halfway there by wanting to do it and cover it and do more. Maybe in a smaller organization, you can, it requires a lot of, I guess, like individual upskilling and speaking to the community, but there may be also like less organizational pushback or an easier way to kind of measure in small communities impact and other metrics to show that the stories are doing well, and kind of like experimenting a bit more and finding what does well. And then, connecting, like I said, with like covering climate now, this webinar, other organizations, to just, if you feel like you're kind of, the confidence isn't there around some of the like principles of climate journalism. And then the other thing that Andrew said is like, I guess just with the other stories, making those connections back to climate change, I think is really powerful as well. Like you said, in regional communities, often, you know, say crop yields or drought or things like that, like making that connection really clearly back. I think it doesn't always have to be like a literal front on climate story.
I think Andrew's really successfully talked about the value of those cross newsroom collaborations. I'd add a couple of other things from the team of journalists I work with in Denmark, who are freelancers largely, and they have been able to really successfully leverage journalism grants to build their resources. This surprised me, but it turns out there is a lot of money out there, even not in America, but in other countries, that can support doing climate stories to a high level. They'll pay for travel, they'll help to promote it. So that's one way. I think the other way is consider other ways of growing your niche. One of my colleagues up there had a very successful personal newsletter that she was able to build that really was very narrowly focused on climate, almost a narrow cast, but she was able to, you know, get a really strong, loyal audience. And it's not huge, but the value is in the loyalty and the level of interest. So I think for those journalists, you might find some value in really narrowing down to quite a thin audience of highly engaged consumers.
I'll just
Andrew?
add.
Yep, some closing comments. Yep.
I'll add very quickly. For those individuals or those organizations with very limited resources, Jo said it, and I just want to draw it out, but I think seek out communities of journalists who are covering climate and the environment. They absolutely exist. I think that we, you know, have all kind of been taught or have tended to think of journalism as a competition-driven industry, and certainly for, you know, some larger outlets and for folks on the business side, that remains true. But I think that in the community that we have, you know, helped to build it covering climate now, but certainly there are, you know, many other organizations that have contributed, that have created communities like this. I'm constantly kind of impressed and encouraged at the amount of people that just want to help each other. That, I mean, we have at Covering Climate Now, we have a worldwide Slack community.
I was about to ask if you had a Slack.
Yeah, we do. And it's just, it's, you know, I apologize that I don't know the numbers of people in it, but I think it's thousands. And people are posting in and asking, you know, questions about, hey, I want to cover this. Does anybody have advice? Hey, I've been pitching around this story and can't get any traction. Does anybody have an editor they might point me to? And I think that a lot of journalists are happy to help. So to the extent that people are running into challenges in their own area of the world, I'll bet those challenges have been experienced by journalists in similar positions elsewhere. Seek those folks out, and I think that everyone will be surprised to find at the amount of helping hands that they find reaching out to them.
Fantastic. Andrew, would you mind just popping the link to the Slack into the chat box as I wrap up, because we are already at 10:59 Sydney time. So I just wanted to thank all of our 4 wonderful guests. So Joe Lauder from the ABC Climate Team, Liam Mannix, the National Science Reporter from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, Andrew McCormick, of course, from Covering Climate Now, and Tim Weller, who's joined us as our sponsor from Talem Media. Tim, sorry, would you like to just close us out, if that's okay?
I just really loved hearing the conversation, and I've just been dazzled. And I think it's a great mix of that informative, interesting and important topics that you guys are talking through that yeah, we need to keep it at the front of everyone's agenda. So just well done to you all. Really happy to hear it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. All right, friends, that's it from us. And obviously you can catch up with this. This will be on our website in the next few days, and you can subscribe to our newsletter, of course, to keep in touch with the events and activities that we have coming up. So thanks so much for your time and have a wonderful day. When I hit stop, it stops, so it will disconnect the call. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you all.
Okay.